This is part two of the tribute to John Taylor Gatto. I think it's important to talk about people when they make a massive impact on society, in this case, on school and education. And I also think it's important when somebody who's a regular person does that. We get too often all caught up in times when people who are at the top of the pyramid or members of the elite or, God forbid, a politician, people seem to venerate these people. And it's not always the case that regular folk who do things that are incredible get recognized. So this is my chance to do that. So the first part of the Gatto tribute was last week, and this is part two. I have a couple of things I want to talk about because you have some points when it comes to John Taylor Gatto, what he was able to do, and how he was able to change people's minds and how he was able to affect regular people. One of the things with Gatto in his analysis of school was the impact that the people in particularly the coal industry, but it wasn't just the coal industry, it was America itself, people who had gotten to the top in what was probably the most free enterprise friendly time ever. We are talking the United States before World War One. And those people had gotten to the top. And what they realized was that if they could get to the top, then anybody else who was willing to work as hard or harder or came up with a better idea could take them out. And one of the things that Gatto realized in his research for the underground history of American education was that the word overproduction was used all the time. And it was used for two things. One of them was a very economic idea where if the capitalist system is going and running reasonably freely, you could have an overproduction of goods. If you made stoves, well, there's nothing to stop other companies from making stoves. And while you may be doing well making stoves now, well, all the other companies are going to open up stove companies and they're going to make them, and they're either going to sell them for less or they're going to make a better stove. And you know what that means for your very comfortable stove making lifestyle where you've made good money? It puts it at risk. And so the top of the pyramid needed to basically put a huge brake on free market capitalism because it just meant regular people could take them down. And you can't have that. The other thing was overproduction. This other meaning of overproduction was the overproduction of quality people. And I'll say that again. The overproduction of regular people. And if you're willing to strip away some of your biases and you're willing to strip away some of the confirmation bias and local bias and political bias, there are a lot of exceptional people out there. I work in a high school that's at the bottom of the list for achievement. And there are a lot of amazing people in that place, and they're all under the age of 18. So the people in the upper levels, they didn't want overproduction of goods or anything else, because if you sell oil or pianos or stoves or steel, talking to you, Andrew Carnegie, you don't want other people to be able to do what you did. Look at Carnegie's biography. If you're at the very top of the heap, you don't want any Andrew Carnegies coming out of the system, or Thomas Edisons, or Henry Fords, or any of these people. You don't want them around. You don't want them to take your spot with their ingenuity, wherewithal, and hard work. So you put a stop to it. And you do that two ways. You teach people in school that they should be relegated to their certain level in the hierarchy, and you teach them that in school by giving them meaningless tasks and allowing people to kind of gauge each other and place themselves in the hierarchy. Think of the high school hierarchy that you went through. Think of the cool kids and the uncool kids. That's what I'm talking about. That can only be done in school. The other thing is that was a big deal was the idea of production being blocked by way of licensing and control of the money supply, and that the government needs to, in the progressive era, scientifically manage things and people and parts of society. That too can only be done in school. You can't do that anywhere else. And that's why when you think of or are confronted with a problem in society, what do you think of as an answer? 9 out of 10 regular people, not you guys, of course, because my listeners are special and different, but the rest of the people, 90+% of them say, oh, government needs to pass a law or fix the problem, right? Government, if there's a problem in education or healthcare or finance or transportation or medicine, or you pick the area, well, the government needs to fix it. It used to not be that way. And Gatto was able to connect this overproduction idea to the fierce backing of the school movement by the Rockefeller Foundation, eventually the Ford Foundation, but early on the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. And Woodrow Wilson was a Rockefeller guy. Woodrow Wilson was basically a pawn of the top interests in American finance and American industry. And he even spoke to a bunch of school officials, and he said, and you can read his quote, he in effect says, we want one class of people to get a wonderful liberal arts free education, and we want a much larger class of people to do important yet somewhat meaningless tasks. In other words, we need a bunch of factory workers who aren't going to ask questions and aren't going to question authority. That's what we need. And Wilson, a progressive Democrat hero, said this very clearly. You can read his own words. And so Gatto sees this, and he sees this at the beginning of the serious let's get school going movement in the late 1800s, and then hardcore in the progressive era in the early 1900s. And it really makes you think why they were pushing this idea that had been so foreign before. Why were they pushing it so seriously? And in a way, what it does, that caste system in your high school, cool kids, nerds, jocks, dweebs, dorks, untouchables, weirdos, psychos, goth, that hierarchy, well, it needed to be frozen in place. And you can't do that if people are running around free, asking questions and teaching themselves. It won't work. So you have to implement it somewhere. And it takes, probably takes 12 years to do it. Kindergarten through 12th grade. That's what you need. You need that much time to have a hierarchy forced on people. And so that really is, Gatto talks about it in a much more detailed manner. But what that is a victory of the managerial class. You have a managerial class that is embedded in the school system, and they allow the stratification to happen. And then to be even more sinister, let's say, Gatto did some research on the early pioneers. Well, pioneers is one way to put it, but the early advocates of the school system. And what they do is they talk about the function of school. And there are 5 functions of school that basically are talked about by James Conant and Alexander Inglis. These are Ivy League people who were the early progenitors of what we today consider modern day school. And they wrote very clearly as to what they wanted. And I believe it was Inglis, who was a Harvard person. At least there was a Harvard lecture named after him. I believe he was a Harvard guy. But there was a Harvard lecture called the Alexander Inglis Lecture. The Inglis Lecture was a revered position. I don't know if they still have it, but it was named after one of these early advocates and builders of public school. And Inglis had 5 or 6 purposes of school. And they're the stratification of people and create obedient workers and make people conform. But the scary one, and it's a name that he uses, the propedeutic function. And what that is in public schools, you have a small group of people who allow the stratification of people to happen. And Gatto goes into how that stratification of people happens by the tag, right? Talented and gifted classes, or the SP classes, the tracking classes, right? You can see who's where, and you can allow people to figure out what group is the good group, and they control their movements and identify themselves in school. But something even more sinister with that is the fact that you've got in the private boarding schools, you have hugely, I would say, massively much more oppressive levels of education. And those people at the private boarding schools teach a robust, real, what we would consider a classic liberal education. But those are the schools where the Kennedys and the Roosevelts and the families of the elite go. The Hotchkiss, Kent, Exeter, these places. That's where Episcopal, that's where John McCain went. Those people who manage us, manage the herd, they go to the private boarding schools, and they serve this propedeutic function, as it's talked by Inglis, and that allows the managers of society to emerge and control the massive herd of people who otherwise, if they were free, many of them would rise up and simply, not violently, they would just take the place of the elites because they're superior. And I want you to think about somebody like George W. Bush, who was notoriously ridiculed in the press, justifiably, for really seeming like he wasn't that smart. Or, the guy who ran against him, who was part of the same fraternity, in the same college. Right? Think about this. 2004, you have Kerry and Bush running against each other for president of the United States. They went to the same university. They were both part of the same fraternity, really a secret society. And I think they were 2 years apart. And America didn't ask a question. You have to be schooled into oblivion. Or you have to have your strata, your levels of people in your head set up to not notice that those two imbeciles, and Kerry didn't do any better as a student than Bush. He just presented himself better. Hey, I voted for Kerry. He sure did seem a lot smarter than George W. Bush. But Kerry didn't. Go look it up. Kerry was no academic star. Bush certainly didn't seem bright at all. And they are running for president against each other. And a nation of 300 million, did anyone ask a question about that? No, because they'd been taught by school, and this is what Gatto found, they'd been conditioned by school, turned into conformist automatons. And that's the purpose of school. And that's what Inglis said it was. And he's a disciple of John Dewey. There's statues to Dewey probably in every city in the United States. And school is doing what it's supposed to do. Create a vast herd of conformist sheeple who don't ask too many rough questions and cannot rise to the top because they're shackled by now a licensing regulatory thicket that blocks them from doing anything, and a school system that teaches them that they're not supposed to rise up anywhere. They've been identified as losers and misfits and oddballs, and so they don't do anything, and they are not any threat to the very top. And that's what Gatto found out school was about. Now, that's a lot of reading Underground History of American Education. There's a great book called Weapons of Mass Instruction by John Taylor Gatto. Recommend it highly. It's probably his second best one. Dumbing Us Down is another good one. And then on video, there's The Ultimate History Lesson on YouTube. It's called The Ultimate History Lesson, and it's fantastic. Thorough, thoughtful, carefully researched. And it shows you the way Gatto thinks and all the things that he found out in his research of the origins of school. And school is not broken. There's nothing wrong with the school system. I'll say that again. There's nothing wrong with the school system. It's working as it's expected to do. It's expected to create a group of people who can't think for themselves and don't ask question of their betters and don't question authority, which is why you have no questioning of mainstream media or politicians. Look around you and look at your friends. That's John Taylor Gatto's work writ large. That person who doesn't question the New York Times or MSNBC or Fox or the Wall Street Journal or CNN, that person, and there are a lot of these people in your life, that's a product of the school system. It takes 12 years to do that to a free and capable American. Lastly, there are crumbs that you can dig up that will shock you. One of them is a former mayor, I believe he was a socialist, John Hyland. And he was mayor of New York City for a while. Highland Boulevard in Staten Island is named after him. And he said very clearly that the invisible government was now taking over our school system and it needed to be stopped. Now, that's the mayor of New York City, which at the time, New York City had 4 million people. It was quickly becoming the financial center of the universe. And the mayor of New York City, out in the open, not in some memo, not in some letter he wrote to his wife, he out there said an invisible government is taking over our school system and warping the minds of our children. H.L. Mencken very clearly wrote about school, saying it has only been in existence ever in history to make people dumber. He wrote that in the 1920s. Hyland's comment, I believe, as well, is in the late teens, early 1920s. You could look at the Reese Committee. There were government officials. Senator Reese actually looked at, as did the Cox Committee. One was in the 1920s and one was in the 1950s. And they looked at the effect of the foundations, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, but mainly the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. And it looked into those foundations' effect on school in America. And each of them, both of those foundations, or both of those commissions, looked into the foundations and found horrible things. They found complete, unabashed motivation to create a bunch of very left-leaning, thoughtless Americans. They were consciously on the record as to talking about getting rid of the independent thinking, rugged, individualist American ethos. Both of them. And you can find a lot of information on this, and you can look at their findings. I believe the first one was shortened because of World War I. But they looked into it, and those foundations were found guilty of messing with American schools, changing what would have been and was already had become a vibrant, thoughtful, intelligent, economic powerhouse where everybody had a shot. Can't have that. Cannot have regular people having power. And Gatto finds all of this. He doesn't have a conspiracy theory. You can go and look at the Reese Commission now. Turn this video off and look at what the Reese Committee found about the effect of foundations on American schools. You're not going to be happy about it. You're going to be unhappy about it if you're a thoughtful person. If you're an intellectual cockroach, you might nod your head and maybe drool a little bit and then have another Twinkie. But the rest of us are shocked by this kind of thing. There's also a letter to go back to the Rockefeller Foundation. I believe it's called Occasional Letter Number 1. I probably should write this stuff down, but it's all up here, a lot of it in my noodle. And it's written in very plain language, and it's written clearly in its announcement to the world that what it would do in a perfect world, and what it plans to do, is to mold the people in the way that they want to mold them, and to replace parents who raise children the wrong way, and to rework those children into the people that they want. They don't want to, and they say this, they don't want to create priests and lawyers and engineers and artisans. They don't want that. They're like, we have plenty of that. We want docile, thoughtless sheeple. Right? Now, those are my words, but the quote, Rockefeller Foundation, Occasional Letter Number 1, very clearly says what they want. And I guess because there was no internet and there was no way of mass communication like there is now, they wrote this stuff down, and you can find it. Now, as a word to the wise, you start digging on these things, into these topics, you're going to be called a conspiracy theorist. And John Taylor Gatto did what very few people are able to do. Somehow he didn't seem to get labeled a conspiracy theorist. I don't know why. But for all the people who criticize him, they don't say, oh, Gatto the conspiracy theorist. They call him an oddball and crazy and all this kind of stuff. But they don't call him a conspiracy theorist. And I think part of it is his delivery and demeanor. But the other thing is the risk that if you do call him a conspiracy theorist and someone looks up anything he talks about, they're going to find it. And so you can't quite do that. You can't have called Gatto a conspiracy theorist because, well, there's just too much fact. So what happens is he was okay, but, you start talking about these kinds of things and you model yourself after a John Taylor Gatto, as I try to quite a bit, you're going to get called names and you're just going to need a thick skin. So, keep researching, keep digging. I'll probably do at least one more tribute to John Taylor Gatto, but I wanted to mention the foundations, Reese and Cox commissions, and the other things that were done in especially the early part of the 1900s to warp American society from a free, open, capable, thoughtful place to a place where now, just like in Europe, just like in much of the Far East, you have a priest class. You have a group at the very tippy top of the pyramid, like the caste system in India. And they rule over us, and nobody asks any questions. And they control your money. They control your future employment. Now they're starting to control what social media platforms you can get on. There are people who think like me that have just been taken off of YouTube. I'm nobody, so it doesn't, I don't reach anyone to cause them to get nervous. But if I had a huge audience, I'd be worried about getting deplatformed, as they've done to many others. So they control everything, and no one seems to ask any questions about it. And that's not normal. Remember, the children around you ask a lot of questions, and you did too, before you went to school for 12 years and had it beaten out of you. I'm Doug Marola, freelance teacher. I recommend John Taylor Gatto's work. There's a ton of his stuff on YouTube for now. And you should do a little bit of digging and find out what is the purpose of school. I'll talk to you next time. You've got homework, but it's only reading. And we'll talk about it more later. Take care.